Tonight on NewsHour, from New York to Hong Kong, diplomacy, defence and trade dominate the headlines. At the UN, Gaza's ceasefire faces new strain. Washington turns up pressure on Moscow. Latin America pushes back on US policy. Europe commits more to Kyiv. And Wall Street ends on a high. To our first story on Gaza tonight, Vice President J.D. Vance said just a few days ago that the ceasefire deal was going better than expected. Well, since then, an emboldened Israeli parliament voted to pass a bill that many critics have called an obtuse move towards the annexation of the West Bank. Vice President Vance branded it as a very stupid political stunt. Now at the UN, diplomats weigh how to keep Gaza's fragile truce on track.
As the ceasefire brokered by the United States earlier this month in Gaza continues under close scrutiny, the UN Security Council remains focused on balancing humanitarian relief with security responsibilities in both Gaza and the West Bank. Diplomats debated the future of the ceasefire, the plight of hostages, and the urgent need for humanitarian aid. Palestinian Deputy UN Envoy Majed Bamia said the Palestinian Authority must be empowered to fulfill its duties and that Israel's obligations also need careful monitoring.
The efforts to undermine the Palestinian Authority and its ability to perform its duties, despite its full-fledged commitment to peace that has been put to test over the course of the last 2 years in unbelievable manners, aims at preventing our independence and our statehood. If there are requirements placed on the Palestinian Authority, it must be empowered to fulfill them. And Israel has also obligations that need to be monitored and implemented. We will not shy away from our obligations and from our commitments.
Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, responded, highlighting the ongoing hostage crisis.
Our struggle is not over. There can be no peace, no future, and no rebuilding of Gaza while terror still remains. 13 fallen hostages remain in Hamas's hands. We will bring them home and give them the dignity they deserve. The world must keep the pressure where it belongs, on Hamas, to return the hostages, to lay down its weapons, and to honor the peace plan it signed.
The US also condemned attacks on civilians and hostages, calling for global outrage over recent killings.
And for the global community that has been protesting and demanding peace for the Palestinian people, for the people of Gaza, where is the outrage? Where is it over these executions we've seen in recent days? Hamas is not just attacking Israelis. It's not just terrorizing hostages underground. It's not just using bodies as psychological warfare on families. They are openly killing their own people for propaganda, in addition to the human shields that they've used over the past years. And candidly, shame on the world.
Earlier, Israel's parliament has preliminarily approved a bill to extend sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, a move condemned by Palestinians and closely watched by Washington.
To Washington now, and analysts and economists alike are busy making sense of President Trump's so-called tremendous new sanctions of Russia's biggest oil companies. But is this about doing real financial damage, or merely just a signal designed to bring Putin back to the negotiating table?
Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday downplayed the impact of fresh U.S. sanctions on his country's two biggest oil companies. He called the penalties an unfriendly act that, quote, will have certain consequences, but they will not significantly affect our economic well-being.
The impact will be significant. That's no doubt about it.
While Moscow may try and tout its resilience in the face of sanctions, Reuters editor Dmitry Zhdanikov says the Kremlin will feel the bite.
Yesterday, the United States imposed sanctions on two of the biggest Russian companies, oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. But similar sanctions have already existed on the number 3 and number 4 Russian oil company, Gazprom Neft and Surgut. Those sanctions didn't stop the flows of oil. India and China were still taking Russian oil. But what happened is that Russia had to offer steeper discounts when selling oil. So that means less revenue for the Kremlin.
Trade sources told Reuters Chinese state oil majors have suspended Russian oil purchases in the short term. Refiners in India are set to sharply cut their crude imports. The sanctions set crude oil prices up more than 5% on Thursday.
They're massive sanctions, and sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil.
The move is an attempt by U.S. President Donald Trump to squeeze Russia's finances and try to force the Kremlin toward a peace deal in Ukraine. And they mark a U-turn by Trump, who only last week said he believed Putin wanted to reach a deal and even soon hold a summit to try and end the war. The U.S. said it was prepared to take further action as it called on Moscow to agree immediately to a ceasefire in Ukraine. Moscow has insisted Ukraine cede more territory before talks can begin.
Well, staying with the US now, but shifting to agriculture, America's farmers voted overwhelmingly for President Trump in the 2024 election. But the president's latest move to quadruple beef imports from Argentina is causing anger across the US cattle farming community, with some saying they feel like Trump is selling them out. The whole idea was to try and bring down record high prices at home. But this growing discontent amongst farmers is proving to be a very real political problem for the Trump administration.
In a push to lower beef prices at the supermarket, the Trump administration is allowing 4 times more Argentine beef into the U.S., and American ranchers aren't happy. The U.S. is raising the cap on low-tariff Argentine beef to 80,000 metric tons, making it cheaper to bring in. That's happening as beef prices hit record highs in the States, driven by tight cattle supplies and strong demand. But hiking imports has angered U.S. ranchers, who largely supported Trump in his campaigns for president. They say the government should back U.S. producers and that increased imports threaten their livelihoods. Meanwhile, Argentina's beef industry is celebrating the move. Exporters say the expanded quota opens a major trade opportunity, especially as Brazilian competitors face steep new tariffs.
This is very good for us as an industry, as a country, especially when we have a competitor like Brazil, which has large quantities of meat. But Brazil pays 50%. That is, it's a competitor whose competitiveness has been taken away.
In 2024, the U.S. imported about 33,000 metric tons of Argentine beef, just 2% of total imports. Most of it is lean meat used in hamburger blends, and analysts say even with a bigger quota, it won't do much to lower prices. U.S. cattle supplies are at their lowest in decades, after droughts wiped out grazing lands and drove up feed costs, forcing ranchers to reduce their herds. Some of Trump's Republican allies are voicing concern over the beef import policy, saying it could hurt the domestic cattle market and threaten food security.
And in Colombia's capital, Bogotá, President Gustavo Petro has dismissed US aid cuts as symbolic, whilst also warning that military funding reductions could soon start to bite. His criticism of Washington's strikes and tariffs has heightened tensions across the Americas.
Colombia's President Gustavo Petro said on Thursday that cutting aid from the U.S. would not hurt his country much. He claimed that he has never seen the aid in the Colombian budget, but that it goes to NGOs that USAID manages outside the government. He added that, quote, "It's kind of aid for U.S. employment." But Petro did admit that changes to military funding could have an effect.
En la ayuda militar, pues tenemos algunos problemas. In military aid, we may have some problems. Let's say military aid has served to deliver arms when they're needed. There are warehouses full of arms oxidizing as they were not needed or were bought under opaque interests. There are corruption problems that the aid has generated. In my opinion, the instruction I've given the military forces I command is to replace the aid with the national budget. In other words, Colombia will buy its own arms.
Es que reemplazamos la ayuda por el presupuesto nacional. Es decir, Colombia compra sus armas.
Colombia was once among the largest recipients of U.S. aid in the Western Hemisphere. But this year, the money suddenly dropped when USAID, the U.S. government's humanitarian assistance arm, was shut down. The Trump administration has already decertified Colombia's efforts to fight drug trafficking, which opens the door to potential further cuts. Petro has objected to the U.S. military strikes against vessels in the Caribbean, which have killed dozens and inflamed tensions in the region.
Well, he's a thug and bad guy.
Trump responded by calling Petro a, quote, bad guy, which Colombia's government says is offensive. Although Trump has not added new taxes beyond the 10% already on Colombian products, he said on Wednesday he may take serious action against the country. Petro said Trump probably won't tax oil and coal, which make up 60% of what Colombia sells to the US. And he said Colombia can find new buyers for other products. Higher tariffs would go against long-time US policy that free trade can make legitimate exports more attractive than drug smuggling. Experts say more duties could eventually bolster drug trafficking.
Back across the Atlantic to Brussels now, where European leaders have pledged to fund Ukraine through 2027. Ursula von der Leyen says the bloc's latest sanctions strike at Russia's war economy has fresh financial frameworks start to take shape.
European leaders committed to ensure that Ukraine's financial needs will be covered for the next 2 years. We have asked the Commission to put forward options as soon as possible, so that Ukraine has the resources it needs to continue defending itself and fight for a just and lasting peace in 2026 and 2027 if it's necessary. Russia should take good note of this. Ukraine will have the financial resources it needs to defend itself against Russia's aggression and in the foreseeable future. Now, the technical, legal and financial aspects of Europe's support need to be worked on, and we will return to this issue in the December European Council.
Indeed, this morning we adopted the 19th sanctions package. It is a wide-ranging and extensive package that hits at the heart of the Russian war economy.
And indeed, in Kyiv, President Zelensky's plans to buy up to 150 fighter jets from Sweden, a major step to strengthen Ukraine's air defences and also modernise its military capabilities.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is seeking to buy up to 150 Gripen fighter jets from Sweden, as Russia's war in Ukraine shows no sign of ending soon. Zelensky said Ukraine hopes to receive and start using them next year. Here's a closer look at the jets and what they could bring to Ukraine's front line. The Gripen, Swedish for Griffin, is a fourth-generation light, single-engine supersonic fighter jet. It's a so-called multi-role fighter aircraft, designed for air-to-air combat, aerial bombing, and reconnaissance. It is seen as a solid, low-cost alternative to more expensive fifth-generation planes like the F-35. The latest version can refuel, rearm, and be back in the air in 10 to 20 minutes after landing, and is capable of operating from relatively rough airstrips. Swedish media said Gripens were used in direct combat for the first time this year, when Thailand deployed fighter jets in confrontations with Cambodia. Before that, it had mainly been used for air policing. It was deployed to Poland this year as part of a NATO mission to patrol Allied airspace. The Gripen has been exported to South Africa, Thailand, Brazil, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Colombia has said it plans to buy several, and Peru is also eyeing a deal to replace its aging fleet.
News from Asia now, and President Trump says he expects to make a deal with Xi Jinping when they meet in South Korea, aiming to ease trade frictions and discuss steps towards ending the war in Ukraine.
I think we'll make a deal.
U.S. President Donald Trump said on Wednesday he expected to reach agreements with Chinese President Xi Jinping when they meet in South Korea next week.
We'll make a deal on, I think, everything. I think we're going to make a deal on soybeans and the farmers. I think we're going to make a deal on maybe even nuclear.
Trump has sent mixed signals on the Xi meeting in recent days. Despite telling reporters just a day earlier that it might not happen, Trump sounded more optimistic on Wednesday. Trump said he planned to discuss China's purchases of Russian oil and how to stop Russia's war in Ukraine. He added he believed that Xi had shifted his thinking on the war and would be receptive to a discussion about ending the conflict.
He would now like to, I'm not sure that he did at the beginning, he would now like to see that war end.
Trade tensions between the U.S. and China, the world's two biggest economies, flared in recent weeks after months of relative calm. Trump imposed additional duties of 100% on China that are due to take effect on November 1st, after China announced export controls on nearly all rare earths. The U.S. president on Wednesday downplayed the importance of China's rare earths curbs, describing tariffs as a, quote, more powerful issue. Meanwhile, officials in Washington prepared to hit Beijing with fresh measures if no deals are reached. Reuters reported that the Trump administration, in retaliation against Beijing's latest round of rare earth export restrictions, is considering a plan to curb a wide range of software-powered exports to China, from laptops to jet engines. That would make good on Trump's threat earlier this month to bar critical software exports to China. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy did not comment on the specific U.S. measures under consideration, but said China would, quote, take resolute measures to protect its legitimate rights and interests if the U.S. proceeds down what it views as a wrong path.
Now, in London, Britain's latest report on Hong Kong accuses authorities of eroding transparency and tightening security laws, a move that critics say further curbs the city's freedoms.
In the biannual report, British Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper says she is deeply concerned over the continued erosion of democratic rights and freedoms in Hong Kong. Now, Cooper calls it hardly surprising that hundreds of thousands of people have already left the city to live in places where those freedoms are better protected. Now, in response to the Beijing-imposed national security law, the UK offered Hong Kongers with British national overseas status and their families a visa in 2021, which allowed them to settle in the UK. Chinese authorities say the national security law has restored stability in the city, but critics argue it's been used to silence dissent. The report says that the use of national security legislation diminished political autonomy and pluralism, noting two pro-democracy parties had moved to disband this year. It highlights the continued imprisonment of British citizen and media mogul Jimmy Lai, who is awaiting a verdict in his national security trial. The UK is calling for his immediate release. The report also criticizes the diminishing transparency of the Hong Kong government, pointing to the removal of public records by the Office of the Ombudsman and the withholding of transcripts from the chief executive's question and answer sessions in the legislature. However, it does say the city's economic freedoms remain broadly preserved and noted engagements between the UK and Hong Kong governments with a number of meetings between officials. In response, a Hong Kong government spokesman hit back, defending the city's national security laws, saying the UK has distorted the facts and calling on the UK not to interfere with China's internal affairs. Laura Westbrook for Anewz in Hong Kong.
And finally, some positive news from Wall Street. Intel's shares have surged after a sharp earnings turnaround. The chipmaker beat forecasts on profit and revenue, capping a 90% rise this year amid sweeping cost cuts.
Intel's stock jumped as the company beat estimates for its third quarter earnings on Thursday. The company said it earned an adjusted 23 cents a share, on sales of $13.7 billion, outperforming expectations of a profit of 1 cent per share. Net income came in at $4.1 billion, compared to a $16.6 billion loss the same time last year. It marks the Silicon Giant's first earnings announcement after multi-billion-dollar investments from NVIDIA and SoftBank, as well as an unprecedented stake from the US government. The turnaround comes after CEO Lip Bhutan's drastic cost-cutting measures. Besides paring back expensive manufacturing processes, Intel will end this year with a workforce that is over 1/5 smaller than a year ago. Intel's share price dropped about 60% last year after concerns it would struggle to rival AMD in making PCs and CPUs, and Intel's fruitless attempts at breaking into the AI chip market. Now in 2025, Intel stock has risen nearly 90% so far, outperforming NVIDIA. It forecasts a fourth quarter revenue between $12.8 to $13.8 billion. Intel's finance chief Dave Zinsner said on a conference call demand for Intel's chips was strong enough during the third quarter that the company is tight on supply. However, for its high-efficiency 18A chips, he said yields for those, a measure of how many chips come out usable, would not be at an industry-accepted level until 2027. Reuters reported in August that Intel is struggling with yields on its 18A manufacturing technology.
And that is NewsHour for tonight. From the UN to the markets, diplomacy, defence and trade continue to redraw the global landscape. From all of us here at Anewz, thanks for watching.